Well, good afternoon. What an honor it is to be asked to be a part of this symposium and to be able to impart some of the teachings of Suzanne Harjo and the things that she was able to do for all of us. And so, as Duke Harjo will understand, growing up in a household where advocacy, you're born into that. There is a, starting off early than I expected, Jody. Some of us grew up in a way where Suzanne was she was bigger than not just a person we talk about in context of advocacy, but a person we talked about around the table in our home. Because, it was the nature of, and sometimes she was there for that conversation. And so I'm just thankful that we can talk about these issues and celebrate her in a way that is not only fitting for her because of what she achieved as an advocate, but it paved the way for us to be advocates in a way that did not exist for many people. So advocating in a way where you remained the good Indian in the eyes of the institutions was something that a lot of people stuck to. But Suzanne was one of those that paved the way and knocked down barriers and just cut through them and allowed us to be advocates in a way that sometimes was controversial. And many of those, and I'm going to talk about that today, I'm going to talk about this issue of indigenous personhood and what that means. Because once you get into a question like that, it's inherently controversial. And so when you deal with questions of who is an Indian or a Native person, there are those who don't like the answers to that, because sometimes it can be you can be included in that and sometimes excluded. And so Suzanne, when I heard this morning, when I saw it on, it's a guardian. Well, as an Osage, a guardian means something else. So I like the part about protector, because Suzanne was the one who was a leader in saying, we are going to have to protect ourselves about the core of who we are. And the rights that we have that are exclusive to us as tribal people, that sometimes mean we have to say, we have to protect ourselves against those that would appropriate that identity. And so indigenous personhood today and sovereignty is what we're going to get into today. And before, up until the last few years, the idea of this question has always been around, trying to sort out who is a community member or who can answer the question of who an indigenous person is. That's been around for a long time. But because we've seen recently with Christian Dior and Johnny Depp, they decided to match the idea of sauvage with a indigenous concept. Now the world is looking at that question. Because of the campaigns of Elizabeth Warren, all of a sudden we now see the world is looking at this question of who is a Native person. Because before that, these questions were we were largely invisible to the world. In many ways, the studies of the conclusions of the Reclaiming Native Truth Project, headed by Crystal Eckehawk and her organization Illuminative, it focuses on this invisibility based on very recent data of what non-Indians, how they perceive us. And so the bottom line, one of the messages of that research is that invisibility is the new racism. But that racism and invisibility has been around for a long time. If you were here this morning and saw what Suzanne said on the Oprah show, she said that in the minds of most people, we're dead, gone, buried, and forgotten. That's why these issues that she has been fighting for so long do not get the kind of attention that we're seeing on this question of indigenous personhood today. So where do we start? Where do we start? Well, before the coming of non-Indians, these questions of who belonged to a tribe or who was a community member was decided among ourselves, and different tribes had different ways of dealing with those issues. But certainly tribes had people we organized on how we dealt with each other. And occasionally there were changes to that if we had conflict with other tribes and people were incorporated into another tribe after having been through some sort of conflict. Or we see situations where persons who were a part of the community violated cultural norms or societal norms, and those persons were excluded from that or banished from the community. So people came inside and out of that definition of tribal community. In fact, there was a story of one of my forefathers, Sumanyekathy, who had married a woman. He was from the Bear Clan, Otoe-Missouria Tribe, and he married a woman through an arranged marriage from the Eagle Clan, which was a highly celebrated marriage and highly looked upon marriage. And they came to Washington, D.C. together, he and his wife. And they came here and they were, she was regaled for her beauty. And she came to Washington, D.C. and then went home and got the measles and died when she was home. And the nature of that relationship that that person had as a leader of the community, he had to deal with, even though he was a chief, he went to live with relative tribes because of his mourning. He could decided, I'm leaving my tribal community because I can't get over the loss of my wife. And he went to another community and lived there until for some time they came and got him and made him a chief again. So the coming and going within community pre-contact, now there was a lot of tribal norms that were associated with that varied from tribe to tribe. But then you had the federal government and contact with non-Indians that came. And so there became a lot of adjustment to dealing with intermarriage with non-Indians, with dealing with the federal government. And so that led to a difficult time where our identity as individuals and our association with tribes became a question not only for ourselves, but one where the federal government decided it was going to get into those questions of who we are. So as a process of trying to say, we're going to allot your lands, we're going to take your communally owned lands and break them into individual pieces, we necessarily need to make a list of who those individuals are. And in some circumstances, when the person came forward and they said, I'm a native person from this tribe and therefore I'm due land because of this allotment, and the leaders of the tribe and the people from the community said, we do not know who this person is. And sometimes there's evidence that the superintendent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the time would ask the person, okay, are you for or against allotment? Oh, I'm for it. So, okay, I'm adding you to the list. So we had interference with our own definitions of who we are based upon that sort of federal interference. Now that got changed too, now that things have not come full circle, but almost. I mean, now these questions of how the federal government deals with Indian tribes and who they consider citizens of their respective nations is largely, there's greater deference to those sovereigns today. And so we see now that when my grandfather, Francis Pipestem, he said, you know, he couldn't understand that when he talked about who were the Jiwidi Nutachi people, his definition of that was somebody, we've been given ceremonies and ways to pray that nobody else was given by our Creator. And if we use those things, that is who we are. That defines who we are, is the use of those ceremonies and the use of those implements of prayer. But at the same time, beyond that traditional definition, he was also the chairman of the Otoe-Missouria Tribe for decades. So he understood that there are people who do not fall into that category of tribal citizens that use those things for any number of reasons. Either they've decided it was no good. Those ways of prayer and those ways of being and those ways of relationship with community, I'm no longer accepting as valid. And there were people who were citizens who were of that mind. Or because of the trauma that our communities were dealing with, they were just excluded from that. And so he understood, even though what he thought was at the core as a created people and as a created individual, that if that's what separates us, there is some distance between who we are as a people by a traditional definition and who the sovereign tribal government decides is a citizen of the tribe. So as we find ourselves today in modern tribal government, you see that the tribes are now making definitions based upon their sovereignty in ways that I think the federal government never expected. So there are new innovations among tribal people in governmental context of creating standards for citizenship that not only acknowledge those roles of people that were created and descendancy, but now we're seeing tribes say, the people who, if you are also descended from another tribe, we're going to accept that as a part of your qualification to be a part of our people. We're also going to say, as we set standards going forth, that children of certain marriages will be eligible for membership or excluded. So as you talk about who you bring into the tribal community, who you make kinship with, and who you bring into this tribal community, it matters. And so you see those standards being created where if you're born on the reservation, you have an opportunity to be a part of the community that otherwise you would not be able to enjoy as a citizen. So tribal governments are moving away from federal definitions, from exclusively blood quantum, from exclusively saying, okay, you're on our list and you descend from a person on that list and we're just going to accept that. Now that's not been a quick process, but you're seeing those sort of sovereign definitions evolve and continue to better reflect who they are as a people. So the distance between what Francis Pipestem said as a traditional leader and as a hereditary chief, and between what the government that he chaired as a chairman of the tribe, that continues to get closer and closer over time because we have that authority to restore that. And that's largely a lot about the story of Indian country. How are we healing ourselves? How are we restoring ourselves, not only as a matter of government and relationship to our citizenship and how we define ourselves, but in many, many walks of life. So the work that Suzanne does, and I think I've read everything you've written, Suzanne, more than once in this area, is what Suzanne was willing to say that people sometimes did not want to hear, was that there are people who are claiming and appropriating these identities that are not one of us. Now that's, again, we're getting into something that some people didn't want to hear. Because of invisibility, some of the institutions would say, the Indians like to fight each other. Goodness gracious. And we're going to honor those that fall outside their definitions of who they are. And so, but Suzanne was one of those people as a protector who said, no, when it comes to the arts, we are not going to accept that anybody who identifies themselves as Indian can claim that and market themselves as that. We are going to say that in the world of education, that if you seek to apply to a school and say, I am a native person, it is not acceptable for you to do that. You're appropriating the identity of someone who might actually provide diversity to that university. Diversity of thought, diversity of ideas, diversity of just because they're in the room, maybe the conversation changes. And if you try to appropriate that identity of a person in seeking to go to that university, then we're going to say, and we're going to identify you and call you out for that. Now the harm, some people will say, oh my goodness, somebody claims to be an Indian because they have some story, a family story, and there's nothing wrong with that. And their family story, they now say, you know what, I want a contract with the federal government because I'm a racial minority myself. But today, there is no longer, we are still in this world of trying to change those rules because now more and more people are seeking to appropriate tribal identity for the purpose of profit. And Suzanne Harjo was one of those that said, we will not accept that. We will not accept that. And what is the harm? Again, There are people who now have more access as artists to markets to help be able to sell and produce art. And I can tell you, if we do not support our artists, they're not going to be able to do what they were gifted to do. And so I believe there are more artists, native artists today, that are able to produce art and make a living because of the work of Suzanne Harjo. I also believe there are more people who are getting those university teaching positions that are actually recognized by their tribal community as native people who are getting those positions instead of somebody who's just has a story of their journey to becoming a native person that is not accepted by their tribal community, their tribal government. But that work continues on. That work continues on. Now, what do we do today there are certainly, so that begs the question, are there people who are not citizens of tribal nations that are indigenous people? Are there individuals who, beyond the sovereigns, are they really tribal or native people? Well, to me, the answer is there most certainly are. There most certainly are. There are people, I can tell you, that full-blood or high-blood Indians, and I did say blood, Suzanne, so don't get on to me there. I recognize it. But she's written about why blood quantum should not be a basis for citizenship, so I want to acknowledge that first. But there are people who grew up in tribal communities that are high-blood Indians that can enroll with a tribe because they descend from more than one tribe. Is that a native person, or is that an indigenous person who we should scold if they seek to express themselves or represent themselves as a native person? I don't believe so. I don't believe so. Are there people who are not citizens who are clanless and their tribes require a clan relationship for citizenship? There are, in my view, are those indigenous people? They are. I have the privilege of being a Wajaji Indian, an Osage Indian, in addition to being Otoe-Missouria. When I was younger, to be a member of the Osage Nation, you had to have a headright or a property interest to receive proceeds from oil from the Osage Reservation to be a member of the tribe. And therefore, if you were from a family where there was 2 Osage parents and there were 4 children, and they decided the oldest child will get all of that property interest, the other 3 would not be members of the tribe. And so we have these strange situations. In fact, that went back to, because of the nature of what was going on with the Osages in the early 1900s, they said, we're creating a role, and that's it. These will be the people on the roll, and at the expiration of 25 years, there will be no more tribal government. There will be no more Osages as a legal matter. Hopefully you will continue to advance yourself as a matter of civilization, and we can end this relationship we have with you. Well, obviously the Osages resisted that, and we've changed the rules, and so it's a different definition today. But where are we today on these indigenous personhood? I want to talk about the unusual situation of Elizabeth Warren, Senator Elizabeth Warren, which has caused, again, I thought, do I even speak about this? But the world's talking about it, right? The world is talking about Elizabeth Warren. Now, Elizabeth Warren, senator from Massachusetts, from Oklahoma, which I like that she's from Oklahoma. She has a family story about being Cherokee in Delaware. She's proud of that story. She expressed that by saying, once I was hired by Harvard Law School, I've identified myself as a Native person for a diversity count. I also said I'm going to participate in creating the Powwow Chow cookbook as a Native person. I also identified myself on the state bar exam in Texas as a Native American. Now, what does that mean? What do we do with that? Because there's a diversity of opinion in Indian country about this. We also know about her that tribal leaders can tell you, usually when they come to town, you get an opportunity to meet with her, and she will advocate for you. She's also got, some have described, the most pro-tribe platform on Indian affairs that we've seen. So in my view, does Elizabeth Warren, because of a family story, mean that she's an indigenous person? No. But is she an ally and, on balance, someone that we should be embracing, as tribal leaders have repeatedly done? I think it's fair that they do that. It also is the case with Johnny Depp. We deal with a situation where now he was adopted into a family. And now he has decided, I'm going to try to match savage with Indian. Well, those are difficult definitions. Adoption, we get into these questions of tribal adoption and family. We deal with every layer of complication in this. But it is appropriate, as Suzanne has done, to say we have to identify people who are appropriating identity, using it particularly for profit or advancement, and to protect ourselves, to protect our young people who are trying to go to college, who are trying to advance themselves, for our young people who are going on to try to teach in universities or looking to advance themselves as a university student themselves, or who want to be an artist. So that sort of protection, and Suzanne wasn't out there by herself. She led NCAI, she led the American Indian movement, she led Vine Deloria Jr. Others came with her and were beside her on these arguments. So I just want to say that, to thank you again, Suzanne, and that oftentimes this, I want to thank the organizers of this, because as when I was younger, the persons who would get into controversial issues, Indians who took stances on things that non-Indians didn't like, were not honored by the institutions like this one. The good Indians were, in the views of those institutions, ones we want to identify as ours. And so, again, Suzanne's leadership was the one that said, we're not, now that Barack Obama has said, we will honor the kind of Indians who will protect their own communities, not just the ones that we find comfortable. Suzanne was the one who knocked those barriers down for us. Thank you very much.